What happens when you take one of the biggest RPG franchises in the world and their popular and wildly fun minigame to create an all-new game meant to capture its very own audience as a standalone game? You have Final Fantasy just kidding. Gwent, the card game minigame within the Witcher RPG series. Someone's daughter might need saving, but it's always a good time to play Gwent.
Wouldn't mind a few rounds of Gwent.
Gwent was a sleeper hit, so much so that the developers behind the Witcher series with Gwent and those at CD Projekt Red decided to create its very own standalone game project and launch it on all platforms October 2018. Gwent, the Witcher card game, would later also come to mobile platforms, see nearly a dozen expansions, and have a number of spin-off single-player projects formed from it as well. At some point, it just seems to dry up for Gwent though, and the game was no longer gaining a new fan base. December 2022, and CDPR would announce no further support for Gwent. For a game that was riding one of the greatest RPGs of the past decade, and had a slew of things planned in its name, it was a rather abrupt and sudden death. What went wrong with Gwent? How did the title manage to go from being one of the most approachable free-to-play card games to being put into maintenance mode just 4 years later? We will find out that and more, including what the largest contributing factors to the game's death are, and put all the clues together for a final deduction at the end of the video to make sure you were or weren't paying attention. Pick your deck, detectives. We have another CCG case to cover. An update for everybody. I'm feeling better than I was before, but still a little bit under the weather, so if you notice some vocal irregularities, well, you can chalk it up to that. And for those that would complain that I would mention this in my script and voiceover, I think you know you can go do it yourself. The story of Gwent, as probably expected by my sharp detectives, starts with CD Projekt Red's The Witcher 3, massively successful launch in February of 2015. The game would go on to net hundreds of millions in revenue, sell 40 million copies, and release multiple successful expansion DLCs. The Witcher series is a favorite of mine, though Witcher 2 is actually my favorite game, but I'll leave that for another video. Within The Witcher 3, there are many things that led to the game's success. A well-crafted story, fun and impactful side quests, very good lore source material, an active, fast-paced combat system, well-made characters, and of course the topic for this video, Gwent. Gwent, in a sense, exaggerations aside, helps break up the monotony that can form from doing the exact same thing, and/or break up the pacing so things are just more approachable. Something much like the very famous Final Fantasy IX Tetramaster also managed to do. There's never not a good time to play Gwent.
I'll gather my men, go there and retrieve Anna.
Ever play Gwent?
I do.
Seriously, it was designed to be fun enough to be able to put time into it, and tied into the rewards and the progress of some of the game's quests in some instances. It was also an easy game to pick up. Coming off the massive success of the Witcher series, CDPR was looking for more Witcher-themed games, starting with the standalone card game based on the Gwent minigame. CDPR's desire to take that to a standalone game was certainly interesting to say the least, as Gwent was entirely offline originally. But CDPR fans were pretty rabid at the time and quite satisfied with Witcher 3 and the series as a whole, so I doubt it was much of a bother to them anyway. Perhaps that's where CDPR's focus was lying. With a gargantuan audience, they only needed a small fraction of that for a successful online CCG standalone game, which would result in far more monetization than selling more copies of Witcher to an extent. At least that's the idea. The Gwent team, which numbered up to 100 developers, was being led by Benjamin Lee, who didn't have a large amount of game development experience, at least that was public, but was an avid CCG fan. On the live ops side of things, the project was being led by the talented programmer Jason Slama. Other leadership would be introduced at later stages, some temporary and some came and gone. But regardless, it was a serious-sized development team working on the title, which made it look like it wasn't being taken lightly by CDPR, unlike many other popular IP spin-offs. Early on, Gwent was far more multiplayer focused, with next to no story or single-player content to experience. CDPR was well aware that their fanbase wouldn't be satisfied with that, as it was already a stretch pushing Gwent online in the first place. That's where Gwent Thronebreaker comes in. Designed by the developer behind the quest in Witcher 3, which is quite the notch, Thronebreaker was a single-player story content utilizing the CCG Gwent as the vehicle for the story. This was an interesting twist on Thronebreaker. It was a standalone game, and yet you could still unlock cards in Thronebreaker to progress and utilize in Gwent, the Witcher card game. But it was set to be very much a standalone game. Whether CDPR did this because it was easier to develop is unsure, but any segmentation of the game's audience is always going to reflect poorly on the game. Most card games, even with single-player stories, don't need an entirely separate game to experience it in. If you guys know me and my series, you know that I both love and hate esports. I love it because I used to be an aspiring pro and I had many great experiences in that journey. And I love the level of competition possible in all of these video games. But I hate how much esports has become shoehorned into projects, sometimes just because that's what's expected, and other times seemingly randomly. Let's get the elephant out of the room. Gwent was never designed as a competitive game originally, and wasn't even when Vladimir Tortsov joined as the head of the esports division for the game. Vladimir would reportedly succeed in shifting Gwent to properly accommodate this desire for competitive play and esports. Which is interesting because sometimes we just have to guess a game strategy, but Gwent was coming out of the gate committing to their very own esport, instead of letting the community create it themselves. Vladimir was quite positive about the progress that CDPR was making from essentially nothing, which was creating not just an esport, but creating a company with the infrastructure that could host it in the first place. With the announcement of Gwent Masters, which was the professional league for Gwent, and the shift of Gwent to a competitive CCG, the fate of the title was sealed before the game even fully launched. Because according to the record books and history we have seen in esports, no successful esport has ever been artificially forced. Not League, not CSGO, not Dota, not StarCraft, not Halo, not COD, and etc. These are mere examples, sure, but all of these games have existed for over 10 years and slowly built their competitive scenes into esports scenes. I was literally there for League, StarCraft, and Halo's competitive scenes just growing on their own, and there was no esports before any of that. Developers and publishers wanting to skip this grassroots process is a tale as old as time, guys. But don't be confused, detectives. It's one we have already read. Artificially creating an esport works only in the short term, and netting more revenue for the game, maybe even selling massively overpriced franchise slots, and arguably it's not even good at creating revenue. At least we haven't seen that yet. Esports still largely operates, in general, in the negative. When some of the biggest esports creators in the space are arguing that the money made in esports is from advertising and skins and stuff like that, and often a losing money affair, that should tell you something important. Gwent shifting in design from the Witcher 3 minigame was already worrying, but CDPR tying their wagon to being a competitive CCG so early on was incredibly risky, given all said. An esports scene without a proper infrastructure and grassroots presence isn't a proper career or career path, which also makes it far less likely for people to pursue such. Sure, you can have your one-off tournaments, but that's not a competitive scene. Could a victory be had for Gwent regarding esports and their push there? I mean, perhaps, but it was a massive risk that showed a blatant misunderstanding of how to build a competitive scene, which shouldn't be too surprising considering CDPR had little experience doing such. Fast forward slightly and we can look at the tournament viewing numbers, which would have a few impressive showings according to esports charts, with peak numbers above 40,000 people. However, this was short-lived, and within a year the peak viewership would never eclipse 25,000, even with several hundred thousands of dollars on the line. These numbers don't make for an esport, artificial or not, because if that's the pro scene, where's the AMI scene? The update that would result in the aforementioned desire to be competitive and overall shifting towards such was dubbed Gwent Homecoming, and would also include a completely revamp of the game, a darker visual palette to be more in line with the Witcher series, the removal of certain cards and mechanics and the third row, aka the siege row, and more. The theme behind the changes was shifting the seemingly hybrid tabletop and CCG game into more of a battlefield card game. Now, I'm unsure of what that actually means besides the point of the game itself being battles on a battlefield. How do you make a card game a battlefield exactly? It feels like a buzzword in that context if I'm being honest, but they were right about so much of the board not being utilized for immediate gameplay effect. So that's a fair point, and the point of Gwent was waging war against each other. Removing a row and leaving the game to just melee and ranged rows now seems a bit strange in the context of that Battlefield stuff, however. I mean, Siege stuff is pretty useful in a Battlefield. Homecoming was essentially the simplification of Gwent, in some respects at least in regards to the fun and unique mechanics that set the game apart, and yet the further jump to a more competitive title overall. Gwent was making the shift from being that fun, offhand mini-game that you played whenever you were killing time in Witcher 3 to now being a full-fledged competitive CCG. And that wasn't necessarily a good thing, as the fan base after the Homecoming update is quite divided. For many fans, the game was never meant to be competitive. It was a spin-off minigame. Sure, some love the changes, the new visual effects, the cards themselves are just absolutely gorgeous, the concept artist did a fantastic job, but that's kind of where a lot of the love terminates. CDPR felt strongly about these changes regardless, and were committed to seeing them come to fruition, regardless if they were being asked for by their audience apparently. But Thronebreaker was set to be the trump card in that respect, which felt a lot more like meeting in the middle. It's a single-player story experience that focuses more on boss fights and puzzles, which was a strong contrast with the direction they were trying to push Gwent, which felt like on purpose to me is kind of my point. Speaking of which, Gwent's concept of a game for those who didn't play it in the Witcher series and aren't familiar with the rules, in Gwent, players play one card each turn from a hand of 10 cards, chosen from a deck of 25. Each deck belongs to one of the 6 factions that offer different playstyles. Melee and range were now the only rows to play on. The goal is to win 2 of the 3 rounds by playing cards to gain points called power on the board. Each card has a certain power which can be boosted or reduced, resulting in the player's points being the total of all of their cards. A player wins a round by having more points on the board than their opponent. Each card can potentially have many special abilities such as the ability to damage other units in deployment, boost other units' point values, spawn other units when conditions are met, trigger an effect when destroyed, and lock another card's ability. Many of these are familiar to those who've played CCGs. Rounds end when either players both pass to the next round or when both players run out of cards. The first to win the 2 out of 3 rounds wins the game. Gwent would have a simultaneous launch with its single-player standalone project Thronebreaker, October 23, 2018. Starting with the single-player standalone project Thronebreaker, designed by the quest creator of The Witcher himself, which would actually manage to score better than the actual card game itself. On aggregate review website Metacritic, Thronebreaker would score an impressive 85 out of 100. IGN called it one of the best written RPGs in years, with exciting card battles that are kept cleverly fresh throughout. While GameSpot stated its tale is mandatory if you're looking for more Witcher lore to chew on and manages to engage you with a strong cast of well-written characters and a suitably dark plot that challenges your morals every chance it can. These were quite the glowing reviews, but not really what this story and video are about, at least not really. Thronebreaker doing well wasn't entirely surprising, as it was in more alignment with what CDPR was good at, good old-fashioned Witcher storytelling. What was surprising was what would become public concerning Thronebreaker the following month, but for now let's get back to covering Gwent's itself reception, which was noticeably more tame than Thronebreaker's, in terms of sheer coverage and publicity alone, but also in terms of how positively received it was. Gwent was able to score a B grade, with an 80 out of 100 on Metacritic, but this would only come from a handful of critics. Starting with GameSpot, who graded them an impressive 8 out of 10, GameSpot would cite the Homecoming changes, as well as the extremely generous rewards of in-game currency and card packs, which make progression feel fair for free-to-play players. Negatives for GameSpot included the pace of the matches feeling far too slow, and matches could benefit from more visual feedback to inform card place with specific abilities. For contrast, in games like Yu-Gi-Oh!, Marvel Snap, and Hearthstone, the games can actually end fairly quickly. Game Informer, another one of the few major outlets to cover Gwent, had the following to say concerning the new CCG. After years of iteration as a minigame and in beta, Gwent has come into its own as a great card game. It emphasizes keen decision-making over chance, and a great back-and-forth build-up ratchets up the tension across multiple rounds. With a great variety of decks and strategies at its disposal, as well as strong incentives to play match after match, Gwent proves great ideas can come from small beginnings. Now, I find this logic quite interesting, because I checked the history of the review writer and I hadn't seen that they had written previously on Gwent before. So perhaps they played it off record, and that was their opinion after the Homecoming changes. But the reason I'm pointing this out is because this is an example of critics taking a widely different perspective than the player base. And in this case, it's hard to argue in the way of critics, with so few of them offering critical opinions on Gwent, and those that did, well, offering very little critical opinions on Gwent. In Game Informer's case, due to likely putting very few hours into the game and not at a particularly high level, they missed out on one of the biggest issues facing Gwent from the Homecoming update on: lack of deck variety. In Gwent, there were multiple iconic and recognizable factions from the Witcher series. The Scoia'taels, everyone's favorite angry elves, the Northern Realm, the Skellig, the Frosty Inclined, the evil monster faction, and of course the neutral factions, as well as more factions added later. Each of these factions had different themes, both visually and gameplay-wise. Which faction you played as depended on your leader card. Each faction had up to 3 leaders to choose from, which really isn't that much in the big scheme of things. If you compare that to MTG, which I get is ancient, but has commanders, which is a similar concept, the black color faction alone has like 9 to choose from. Especially after Homecoming, because then they removed leader abilities as well, and the aforementioned third siege room. In an effort to create a competitive game, they made their meta stale and boring. That's because with the combination of slow update cycles to actually balance the busted cards and the competitive scene, the 3-round base format, the decks you encountered on ladder and unranked were nearly all the same with slight variants. Gwent Masters was in full swing following the launch too, and was chock full of the expected meta decks that were dominating that players would then copy and terrorize ladder with. And sure, their viewer numbers were incredibly low, but players were still figuring out the fastest shortcuts to the best decks. And in a competitive CCG, why wouldn't people just pick the meta decks? It's the easiest way to play the game. Now there was ways to combat this besides just more frequent and active balancing. Now we can't get into the round-based format and how that slows the game down because that's how the game was designed, but you could create another casual game mode that allows for more duplicates, mixing of decks, maybe carrying cards out of meta, maybe just in individual rounds, maybe a more blitz format. These sort of modes and extra ways to play the game help maintain a casual player base while not letting certain decks become too frequent and thus too dominant or stale. The final nail for the lack of build variety in Gwent is lack of standard card game archetypes. Now this is my opinion, and I'm sure some Gwent fans would disagree, but having played the other CCGs pretty religiously at this point, you're making a competitive CCG, which means that no matter what, you're going to be compared to the other games in that space, which means players like myself expect to see the iconic deck archetypes, mid-range, aggro, control, mill, combo decks, and more, which felt really lacking in Gwent, both due to the game design that I just mentioned about the round-based format, which slowed things down, but also just simply availability. The following month, the news I had mentioned that was surprising despite the very positive reception that Thronebreaker received was that the game was missing its sales targets. According to CDPR, who also owns the platform that they utilize, GOG, they would blame such due to the lack of reach of that platform, which is just ironic. Thronebreaker was the better of the two projects though, both according to the player base and the critical reception, which meant it didn't bode well that it wasn't specifically doing well. Though to be fair, it was a $20 purchase that was a technically separate game. It's kinda complicated, right? Which could have also contributed to it. Gwent being free to play in a reportedly fair free to play business model would help the game receive far more players, surely. As expected, the expectation was indeed true. Gwent was also being considered a financial failure. Whether that means that they aimed too high and didn't get the targets that they wanted, or something worse, we're not entirely sure. But Kotaku was reporting a failure nonetheless, which meant that some work was going to be needed to keep Gwent afloat going forward. It's difficult when a CCG can't initially attract a large enough player base, like Marvel Snap, right? Because like other competitive games, once that audience starts to shrink, problems will increase and compact on each other. Less players means less balanced games, and less content as a consequence. The most important thing for a competitive game, let alone a competitive CCG, is balancing. Content is second, but without balanced content, it's not fun or challenging, right? If CDPR wasn't quick to balance things, they would allow such poor reflections of the gameplay to affect the player base going forward. It's unsure when it happened, but it turns out that the prior game director Benjamin Lee that I previously mentioned would leave Gwent and take a job from Activision Blizzard on Team 5, the talented team behind Hearthstone, quietly sometime after launch. Whether Benjamin just got that good of a job offer, or saw the writing on the wall. Gwent's first expansion of Mini would come March 4th, 2019 and add 100 new cards to the game. Such expansions are much needed to inject new content, new gameplay mechanics, new story, and just keep things exciting, right? There was very little hype surrounding the card expansion though, with some players even making jokes about, "I thought this was a battlefield," concerning the addition of new card. Other comments from Witcher fans were concerning how little story and canon there actually is within Gwent itself, which the card expansions weren't going to do much to help. Gwent would be announced for mobile devices finally March 27, 2019. This would make it rather slow in catching up to the competition at that time, which naturally had launched on all platforms at that point. And this was just merely the announcement, with the launch on iOS to come later in the year and the launch on Android to come the following year. This left a sour taste in some fans' mouths because the game wasn't originally created for mobile devices, and yet some fans felt like it was a bit of a bait and switch. Launching on mobile always affects a game's monetization and gameplay, which is why some players can see it negatively. Some people were even suggesting that perhaps that's why the Homecoming update simplified aspects of gameplay to perform better on mobile devices, and focused more on the visual effects and presentations of the cards. The latter, as I've mentioned before, was quite impressive, but the former was quite maligned by the fanbase. Opening Gwent to a mobile audience could at the very least add an additional much-needed audience, however. CDPR would choose to skip a round of needed balancing to seemingly focus more on the next expansion and round of new cards. And this is a common issue with CCG developers, as new content makes more money, simply put, in the short term especially. Fixing your game and selling that isn't as sexy as selling new cards. Novigrad would be that given expansion, and would feature the very first new faction, the Syndicate, and respective cards and leaders, in Gwent as well as 90 new cards overall. The introduction of the new faction without any new story to follow was a strange occurrence. It felt like a missed opportunity. At this point, it seemed like CDPR was content with Gwent just being loosely associated with the Witcher story itself, and just being within the same universe. Which was a shame, considering had they followed the more Hearthstone single-player approach in some respects, there might have not only been more success, but they could have actually charged for the expansions fully too. The fanbase was practically begging for it. More story, more lore, more canon. But with the focus on Gwent being a competitive CCG first, those fans weren't going to have their prayers answered most likely. Gwent would launch on iOS September 13th, 2019, bringing Gwent to the mobile market for the first time. Another card expansion titled Iron Judgment would launch September 14th, 2019, adding 80 new cards and some really cool animated card backs. This update, based on the comments listed, was taken rather positively. Coming as a shock to many Gwent fans, even for those not playing on console, which was the overwhelming majority, was the announcement of a shutdown on consoles for Gwent. Reportedly, the shutdown was realized because the console revenue would only account for 3% overall, which is incredibly low, and likely the juice not worth the squeeze scenario. Gwent's death on console shouldn't be surprising though, as card games have never really traditionally thrived there, especially without a single player focus. But it was another negative bit of publicity for the struggling CCG that seemed to be satisfying at least some of its core audience. Merchant of Fear was the next expansion released December 9th, 2019, this time adding more cards to buy, collect, or utilize. Stratagems would also offer players bonuses, which were chosen in the deck selection, and enemies were unable to disenchant or disable them. Finally, scenarios were added to the game, which played the closest thing to some of the puzzles introduced in Hearthstone's story mode, or even Thronebreaker, or puzzles from chess if you've ever played that. These were positively received. Gwent would finally launch on Android March 24th, 2020, nearly 4 expansions later. With the popularity of the Witcher franchise, however, including the recent TV show, CDPR was still optimistic about Gwent's odds. Gwent would forego sticking solely to CDPR's own platform GOG exclusively on PC, and would launch on the biggest marketplace in gaming, Steam, May 19th, 2020. Gwent by this point had been out for a little under 2 years, and while a Steam launch for some games can be seen as a second launch, for Gwent it was far tamer, only managing to secure 4,800 players peak. Even the trailer released alongside it only managed a few thousand views. Were things already slowing down for Gwent despite a big Steam launch? The Master Mirror expansion would hit June 30th, 2020, adding 70 new cards, keywords, and more. The expansion, according to the Steam charts, did very little to increase the audience. Then again, I don't think that that's the target. CDPR and Steam had a very small but consistent audience that seemed to change very little from update to update, which screams a small loyal fan base and very little more. The forum posting, which was far more common in the previous expansions, was also lacking with Master Mirror, which wasn't a good sign. Gwent would follow that expansion up shortly after, in the winter, with another expansion, this time finally leaning into the Witcher name itself, dubbed The Way of the Witcher, adding not just new cards, but a new mechanic in Adrenaline, which would trigger upon a specific amount of cards in your hand. The expansion would bring the population from a low 2,685 peak to 4,322, but unfortunately, within just 1 month, the population would return to the similar numbers, proving my previous point. It's one thing to utilize a core audience who buys all of your stuff, but when that audience starts to shrink as well, it becomes difficult to continue to create new content. The next expansion to launch the following year would easily be the most controversial. Price of Power, like the name hilariously would imply, would add more power to be bought. Sort of, at least. It would stack the game more in the favor of those who would pay, because it would have a hefty $60 price tag for the 3-part expansion. While previously Gwent had been known as a rather fair monetization project for free-to-play players especially, one can't help but wonder if they were a bit too fair. Trying to monetize a few years into launch in a big way with the introduction of an expansion pass seemed quite risky as an endeavor, but it tells me that either they felt that they were needing that more return on their investment, or were prepared for the pushback that they would most assuredly and definitely got. Complaints from players concerning the price tag, the expansion pass precedent, fear of pay to win, and more. The population data following the introduction of it remained relatively unchanged. In fact, as the year 2021 came to a close altogether, Gwent wouldn't even ever again eclipse 3,000 peak players on Steam. Jason Slama, the director in charge of Gwent at the time, would end up being switched to another project altogether, as a lead creative director now on the new Witcher project, The Witcher 4. This would result in yet another prominent director and leader leaving Gwent. One can't help but feel like that definitely affected things there. And again, whether Jason knew what was coming, or just simply was that talented and put into another position to show off that talent, Gwent would have their final expansion, Black Sun, July 5th, 2022. The Gwent team had already promised less expansions previously, with more focus on balancing and live updates. And Black Sun would prove to be the smallest offering yet in that regard, offering only 27 new cards. Following this expansion, the population on Steam charts would actually drop. This time the lowest it had ever dropped, 2,200 players peak. CDPR wasn't putting in their full effort in Gwent anymore, and it could be seen and felt by the player base, and the player counts were reflecting that. Okay, coming as a complete shock to me, and maybe a few others that didn't know about the behind-the-scenes project dubbed Project Golden Necker, Gwent would be releasing a standalone single-player experience, again, this time borrowing some elements from Slay the Spire, and what was being called Gwent Rogue Mage, or Gwent Rogue Mage of the Spire of the Witcher, or Witcher Gwent Rogue Mage of the Spire. You get the idea. Unlike Thronebreaker by comparison, Rogue Mage felt like an absolute cash grab, and wasn't positively received. It offered nothing new or unique to the table, and felt like a $10 to $20 repackaging of the same game with some single-player puzzles and story. According to CDPR, this was their way of satisfying the true Witcher fans. But I mean, come on, nobody's buying that. Thronebreaker? Yes. But Rogue Mage? Meh. At this point, it felt like CDPR was just trying stuff, or trying to make as much money before their IP inevitably were to crash. But it was bizarre behavior, especially if they actually thought that Rogue Mage would be successful enough to save Gwent. The lukewarm reception for Rogue Mage wouldn't save Gwent. And by December 6, 2022, CDPR would announce just after 4 years they would be shifting Gwent to maintenance mode, which means that they would only be maintaining the game and it would receive no new live content updates. With Steam numbers dropping below 2,000, consoles being shut down altogether, and not much data on how successful the mobile devices were being, which is usually not a good sign because developers brag about that kind of stuff, Gwent in just a short amount of time had burned up in its spot in the sun. While Gwent is technically not dead, maintenance mode is as close as you can get to the living dead. And when you guys hear that music playing in the background, it means that we have gathered enough clues and evidence thus far to diagnose the death of a game, Gwent. Spin-off games galore. Another game built too early for esports. Homecoming heavily shifted the game abruptly. Lack of proper balancing and the speed of such. Lacks the Witcher soul. Lack of demand. And lack of deck variety and archetypes. Now, Gwent might have had the best concept art in the CCG space, arguably. But besides that and being a cheeky off-brand Witcher game, what will the legacy of Gwent be? The failure of Gwent's multiplayer all but confirms that CDPR will likely not venture into that world of CCG again anytime soon. But who knows? Maybe Witcher 4's Gwent will still kick ass. Thanks for watching.